Carter is VP of Research and has recently launched the Linux Foundation Research, a division dedicated to creating and sharing useful insights about the world of open source technology and standards that underpin much of the digital infrastructure on which our global economy depends. So please join me in welcoming Hilary to the stage.
Thank you so much, Laura, and hello, campus party. I am so excited to be back here today to talk to you about all things open source and the Linux Foundation, and most especially Linux Foundation research, a new division near and dear to my heart. So let me begin. For those of you who aren't quite familiar with what open source is, I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction. One of the first things I had to do when I joined the Linux Foundation was collaborate in an article that explained open source to a 5-year-old child. It was a very difficult and challenging task, but I think we succeeded. And the mother and the baker in me used an analogy to help children understand what open source is. And so it went like this. Imagine if your grandmother has a very special recipe for chocolate chip cookies, and only the family knew how wonderful this recipe for cookies was. And your grandmother's wish was that this recipe be shared with the rest of the world so that everyone could enjoy the same chocolate chip cookies that our family has enjoyed for years. But Grandma had one condition. In fact, she had 2 conditions. And those conditions were as follows. Anyone who wanted to use the recipe to make their own cookies could do so. In fact, they could set up an entire cookie factory and sell Grandma's chocolate chip cookies on the condition that they too publish the same recipe used in making those cookies. And the second requirement for open sourcing Grandma's cookie recipe was that if anyone changed the recipe, let's say somebody wanted to add coconut or wanted to add walnuts and decided, hey, these cookies were even better now because I've enhanced the recipe, they were required to send the changes back to my grandmother. And that is how open source software works. It's free, it's open to the public for experimentation and improvements, provided that any changes that are made come right on back to the source. So what else is open source? On principle, it leverages the phenomenon of the wisdom of the crowd. This idea that all of us together are smarter than just one of us. It commonly refers to software which original source code is made freely available and it's redistributed and also modified. The idea being that when more people participate in a technology and have the opportunity to test it, to play around with it, to modify it, make suggestions on how to improve it, that technology becomes stronger and more robust. And that's exactly what we see in open source technology environments. And yes, open source is about more than just hardware. There is an entire spectrum of collaboration, everything from governance to open source software, hardware, community specifications, industry standards, and yes, international standards as well. These are the foundational elements of open source collaboration that impact the functionality of the global economy. And so let me be clear that free does not necessarily preclude non-competitive, and nor does it mean non-commercial. Anyone is free to commercialize and make a lot of money from open source technologies. And believe me, they do. And they have since the beginning. IBM is a terrific example of an organization that has leveraged open source technologies, be they blockchain or other, and provided a whole suite of profitable commercial services around free and open technologies. As Jimmy Wales said, a lot of people who work on open source don't mind making money elsewhere. And we see the fiercest competitors coming together to work on open technologies, all with the idea that they're going to go back to their organizations and launch better products and better services around common shared technology resources. So here are some examples of organizations leveraging open source. For those of you who happen to have an Android phone, as I have a Samsung that runs on Android, 85% of Android phones are built using open technologies. And just as Grandma's cookie recipe requires all of the technology licenses to be listed or her recipe to be listed, the shot on your left of open source licenses is the first screenshot in my phone that lists all of the open source components used to make my mobile phone function. That is page 1. I cannot tell you how many pages and pages and pages of licenses of open source components go into our mobile devices. It's phenomenal. Same thing with Apple. If you want to see the open source technologies that are foundational in everything from Mac to iOS, have a look at Apple open source, and you'll get this sense of how fundamental open technologies are to the most common and widely used commercial technology organizations today. You may have heard the expression that technology is, that software is eating the world. Well, I'm here to tell you that open source is eating software. 80 to 90% of software code base is open source. That is a foundational technology stack in the software supply chain. It underpins everything. So, absolutely a fascinating world of how foundational open source technologies really are. So how did all this begin? And I'm going to take you back to 1991. A young Finnish computer scientist named Linus Torvalds published the Linux operating system. And in that publication, he said, I'm not doing anything big, just something for fun. But he believed that by opening up his technologies to the world and giving Linux to the world, that Linux would get better and it would be stronger because many minds contribute to that growth and that transformation. You've heard the expression, many hands make light work. Well, pretty much the same thing goes. Just like Tim Berners-Lee, Sir Tim Berners-Lee opened up the World Wide Web and said, this is for the world, so too Linus Torvalds opened up Linux operating system, and over the past 30 years, it has become the most prolific piece of software in existence. It is truly ubiquitous, and I'm very proud to say that last week in Napa, California, with Linus Torvalds present, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Linux operating system. We have seen a dramatic explosion in the use of Linux. 100% of the world's supercomputers run on Linux. 90% of all cloud infrastructure runs on Linux. 85% of smartphones that use Android, yes, they also run on Linux. Your car runs on Linux. The airplanes we ride in, they run on Linux. The stock markets of the world run on Linux. You get my point. And oh yes, those helicopters that fly around on Mars, they run on Linux too. It is ubiquitous and profound. I was at Open Source Summit in Seattle, and Chris Dibana of Google said, Linux is the interplanetary operating system. And he said so because it operates applications on Earth, it operates applications in space at the International Space Station, and it also runs applications on other planets. So I thought it was the quote of the conference, and I wanted to share it back with you today. Tux also is our penguin mascot. When I joined Linux Foundation, my daughter said, oh, Mommy, you're working for the company of Tux Paint. And I said, what's Tux Paint? She says, well, that's the software we used in kindergarten to teach us how to do coloring and design on our computers. Makes sense to me because the boards of education did not have to pay for software to help teach children how to use computer animation at a very foundational level. So Tux is a wonderful symbol of Linux. The penguin symbolizes mass collaboration. And if you have not either seen March of the Penguins to understand how penguins cooperate, I highly recommend doing so. And I also recommend a book called The Penguin and the Leviathan by Yochai Benkler. And it describes how mass collaboration triumphs over self-interest every single time in business and government. So do check out that resource to understand the analogy of the penguin and why it's so important as a symbol of mass collaboration at the Linux Foundation and beyond. Tux, by the way, is an open source symbol, so we think he's a he, can be used and cited like other technologies. And 30 years later, in a recent study, piece of research that we did at Linux Foundation, exploring the state of open source in the financial services industry, more than half of the employees within the financial services sector who participate in open source projects, they do so because it's fun. It's a really fun thing to do. People love participating in open communities. They find it a rewarding activity, and I would invite you to get involved in open technology projects yourself. It's a positive thing for the world. It's a positive thing for our contributors. So what is the Linux Foundation? How does this relate to Linux, the software? Well, essentially, we are the home to the world's most important technology projects and communities. We were established to nurture the Linux operating system. Essentially, we pay Linus Torvalds to do nothing more than upgrade Linux. He and two other maintainers upgrade Linux on a regular basis. And that ensures that Linus Torvalds and his time and talents are dedicated to nothing more. But we're more than Linux today. That model of using open frameworks for improving technologies has evolved beyond the Linux operating system. In fact, it's been kind of like a Cambrian explosion. We are now home to more than 750 of the most important shared technology projects on Earth. Everything from cybersecurity, networking and cloud, automotive, blockchain, edge and IoT, web-based technologies, AI, film and entertainment, continuous integration, continuous delivery, energy, hardware, standards, and so on and so forth. Every year, new technologies from new industries come under the Linux Foundation umbrella, where we provide the framework for mass collaboration. It's hard to describe how this phenomenon is growing, and it's growing because it works. It's a framework for success, and I'm super excited that Linux Foundation research exists to help describe what is going on in these different ecosystems. I'll dig in a little bit into just a few to help understand which projects have recently come under the Linux Foundation. In Canada, during COVID, a group from Shopify, team of coders from Shopify, volunteered and they coded up what is now known as COVID Shield, the COVID notification app that was launched by the government of Canada after the technology was donated from the team at Shopify and rolled out to all Canadians so that using our mobile phones, we would get notified if we were in contact within 6 feet of somebody who had been tested positive for COVID-19. After giving the code to Canada, the Shopify team then donated that same code base to the Linux Foundation. And what happened? Well, the team at Linux, they scanned the code for vulnerabilities, and yes, they found some, because more brains are better than few. We patched the code, we re-released it, so Canadians would have gotten an upgrade to their COVID notification app. And now other countries who don't necessarily have the resources of a Shopify in their community, if they need an open source COVID notification app, all they have to do is go to the Linux Foundation, download the code, cite the source, and roll it out. And if they make changes, send those changes back upstream. Similarly, a new project that's come under Linux Foundation is the Prometeo project. This is a health and safety application that is designed to protect the health of firefighters who are on the front lines, who are risking their lives in the face of toxic, highly dangerous environments. So using IoT technologies and AI, firefighters will get an early notification that their vitals are in danger, that their exposure to toxic, dangerous scenarios is at alert level, and it's time to retreat. It's time to remove immediately from the situation. And for those of you who know a thing or two about the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, yes, the film and entertainment industry is collaborating under Linux Foundation as well. It was fascinating to me that this industry that is so well known for making art has come together to create shared technologies. And what we're seeing is that fierce competitors in the movie industry, Disney, Pixar, and Universal Studios, and all of the leading studios come together, and they are building out shared tools because they don't need to create technologies in silos. They need to compete on art, on story. And so we have the Academy Software Foundation, under which a whole group of technologies specific to computer animation and color are managed and maintained in this environment. So I'm just going to give you an example. If we'll run this video now.
Every single part of the filmmaking process is touched by software, and a lot of that software is open source software. The Academy Software Foundation exists to provide a great home for open source projects that we as an industry use every day. Whether you are a user of open source software, or an engineer, or a company that relies on open source software, we want to create the right ecosystem for you to get the most out of the open source software that you need to use.
Awesome. For those of you who have seen Dune, and of course, Denis Villeneuve, Quebec director, will have used many of these technologies in the production of this hit movie. I am very excited that by the time the Oscars roll around in 2022, we will have a research report on the state of open source in the film industry, describing the history of collaboration around Linux operating system and the development of shared technologies within the industry, what kind of value they're adding to this industry not typically associated with open source. So, where do we go from here? How does this apply to you, our audience at Campus Party? Well, On the principle that we are stronger together, we have to get more people involved, that our communities thrive when we have more people participating in them. So this is a principle of Linus Torvalds, and it permeates everything we do at the Linux Foundation. And by the way, participation in open source communities is one of the ways to get noticed by recruiters. So if you are a computer scientist and if you are interested in coding up open source projects, continue to participate, because this is exactly where the Googles and the Apples and the Microsofts and all of our leading technology organizations come to look for top talent. They completely comb open source projects and look for active participants and young leaders of tomorrow. So if you want to know a little bit about what our ecosystem looks like, this is the kind of thing that we're measuring. At the Linux Foundation, we need teams of people to produce the 24.4 million lines of code which are added weekly, and similarly the 14.4 million lines of code that are also removed because they're dated or they've got to be replaced. We have 722,000 contributors. I'm in the ecosystem contributor group because I am not a coder, but there's a place for me as well in open source. We have 12,000, almost 900 repositories, individual repositories. So pick your project. What is your area of interest? Which problems do you want to solve as a young person? Wherever your interests lie, there's likely a project at the Linux Foundation that is specific to your particular technology interest. There are 12.2 million commits to date, 1.4 million pull requests, 2.1 million builds, and so on and so forth. We actively monitor what is going on in our communities, and it is fully transparent. So here's how you can have a front row seat into these individual data points. I encourage all of you to go to our tool landscape. It's called LFX. insights.lfx.linuxfoundation.org/projects. And it is here that you will find all of the different technology projects. You will find information about how many different contributors there are, what is the pace and what is the velocity of code updates, which organizations are participating in these code bases, who is leading, who are the top maintainers, who are the top coders, and where are they from? So it's an open book. So I invite you to set up a Linux Foundation ID, go to LFX, and check it out. It's pretty amazing. And yes, you can expand your career with open source. To date, we have enrolled more than 2 million people in Linux Foundation training and certification programs. I have availed myself of 2 free courses as part of my onboarding to all things open source, but there is no end of subject matter. So get a certification through Linux Foundation training on anything from blockchain to the cloud, Kubernetes, for example, Linux, all kinds of kernel training opportunities, open hardware, open source best practices, and learning about managing the open source program office in an organization. What does it take to create cultures of innovation and manage the licensing requirements of open technologies and consumption of open source code, and to do so responsibly and effectively. There is so much to check out. So if you're interested in lifelong learning, if you want opportunities for self-study, check out Linux Foundation training and certification programs. And now, LF Research. This is a division that I was brought on board to establish for the Linux Foundation. And earlier this year, Jim Zemlin and the leadership team at Linux Foundation had a vision. And it was, what if we created the definitive repository of insights and data into open source and really tell the story of this Cambrian explosion of everything that's going on? and build upon research that was done 15 or 20 years ago by thinkers like Eric von Hippel and Karim Lakhani. But create research for the context of the world we're living today, a world where a pandemic persists, climate change is bearing down on all corners of the world, and technology is accelerating and changing what it means to be a tech company. Now every company is a tech company. And by creating research, we're creating tools that will help inform strategy, it will help inform decision making, and it will help create more resources needed for open source tools to expand and for communities to grow. So I'm very excited to be able to bring this forward. And here's how we're going about it. We are producing research in 3 thematic areas. We're studying open source along industry vertical lines, as I've demonstrated earlier, film and entertainment industry being just one. Automotive industry, telecom industry, financial services industry, public health, government, everything under the sun. We're also looking at open source at the technology horizontal level, everything from AI and edge and IoT, 3D printing, blockchain. There's no end of technologies that we can cover. We're also looking at issues that are ecosystem-wide, looking at how open source is impacting social issues like racial justice, social justice, the establishment of standards, climate projects. So community-wide issues, diversity and inclusion, another important subject area. And one of our first pieces of research that's coming out this December is on the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion in open source. We've come a long way to create inclusive communities, but we have a long way to go still. We're trying very hard to have our communities reflect the unique and diverse composition of all of us in the world, everyone who uses our technologies. Ideally, our communities and our build environments will reflect the world in which we are living today. And like many things at Linux, research is a team sport, and it's an incredibly rewarding pursuit because you cannot create research by yourself. You need the community. You need teams of experts to contribute data or to contribute qualitative insights, to participate in interviews, to take surveys. And there will be no end of surveys coming out of the Linux Foundation. So if you're interested in research and you want to participate in different surveys that we will be launching, give us a follow. Subscribe to our newsletter. Keep in touch with the different opportunities to collaborate in research. It is very, very much a team sport, and it is truly an engagement activity. So with that, I am very happy to connect with any of you who'd like to learn more about Linux Foundation, who'd like to learn more about LF research and the upcoming research projects that we'll be publishing in the next year. Stay tuned, and Campus Party, merci. Thank you so much. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be back.
Thank you. Our next guest is now going to talk to us about a very cool subject, about all the opportunities that there are for you in artificial intelligence. We're going to learn about the skills you need to fill the roles and the jobs that are going to be on demand in the future, and what everything that the AI industry has to offer you.